For today, we're going to have interpretation in 3 languages, in French, English, and Inuktitut. And speaking of Inuktitut, I wanted to just raise to everybody's attention that today is a special day, and it is International Inuit Day. And so this is a very important day for our community to celebrate, and just wanted to get that in the record. So hope everybody gets a chance to reflect on the relationship we have with the Inuit peoples and how we can continue moving forward in society. For those participating in person, welcome. I don't think we have any witnesses on...
One online.
One online for this first panel?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, there, Dr. Coates, I do see you there. Sorry, my apologies. And we just ask people to speak nice and slowly and clearly so that our interpreters can do their job. Just before we get into opening statements, I also want to remind members, that we need to start giving some thought to amendments for this legislation. And so the note that I have is simply that as we approach the deadline for submitting amendments, I'd like to remind members that all amendments, including sub-amendments, must be submitted in writing and sent to our committee clerk. The deadline we established is November 29th. That will come up quickly, so start giving thoughts to those amendments and sub-amendments. If you wish to propose amendments, please send the Legislative Counsel, Alexandra Shora, your written instructions, and she'll ensure that amendments are drafted in the proper legal format. So with that as the official business done, we'll get right into our welcoming. So with our first panel, we have Al Benoit, Chief of Staff, Senior Advisor, Manitoba Métis Federation, and William Goodon, okay, Minister of Housing, Manitoba Métis Federation, and online we have Dr. Ken Coates, Chair, Indigenous Governments Program from Yukon University. We're going to have 5-minute opening statements from the 2 organizations. I'll give you a yellow card when there's 30 seconds left and a red card when their time's up. Don't stop mid-sentence, but wrap it up as much as you can so we can get into our rounds of questions and want to give everybody a chance. With the delay today, we are going to unfortunately have to do a bit of an abbreviated round, but I'll try and manage the time expectations for everyone here. And so everybody's gone through their sound check, and since we have Dr. Coates online, I think we'll start with you just because the technology's there. We have a visual on you, so I'd like to give you your 5 minutes because you never know when the technology might give it up on us. And then we'll come to our witnesses in the room, and then we'll get into our first round of questions. So whenever you're ready, Dr. Coates, the floor is yours, and you have 5 minutes for your opening statement. You're on mute. We need you to unmute. And that's the one thing we can't control in the room. We'll mute you and unmute you, but and I haven't hit start yet, so we'll wait till you get going here, and then we'll give you your 5 minutes.
I should be okay now. Is that right?
Yeah, we hear you. Okay, over to you.
Great. Well, I'm really honored to be here to have a chance to speak to the committee on an issue I think is very vital. It addresses one of the most important and long-standing gaps in Indigenous rights and recognition in Canada. But I have some observations to offer in this, put it in context, I guess. Like most major Indigenous policies, Bill C-53 is seeking to address an historical injustice. At some point, we'll get to the situation where we're no longer having to look backwards and fix the problems of Confederation and look more creatively to the future. At the time of Confederation, the Government of Canada recognized that it had to deal with the Métis. They weren't particularly happy about that. And they did so both as a distinct people, but also as part of the rapidly changing society in Western Canada. At the time, the Métis were very highly regarded for their business acumen, their connections to both the newcomer and Indigenous worlds, and their military prowess. The federal government of Canada dealt with the Métis in the creation of the province of Manitoba, a process that did not end well for the Métis, unfortunately. They made script arrangements that recognized their rights to the land, but that was not managed very well. They confronted the Métis during the 1885 resistance period. After the defeat of the Métis in 1885, the government of Canada effectively refused to deal with the Métis as a political entity or a collective. And this approach held for generations, despite frequent representations by the Métis for greater recognition by the government. The population was dispersed for a variety of economic and social reasons, moving to northern and western districts quite comprehensively. Due to the lack of legal status and recognized rights as Indigenous people, the Métis avoided some of the interventions that were so strongly and negatively affecting on First Nations people. But for example, some Métis folks children were still required to attend residential schools, and they had to deal with widespread economic and social discrimination. but they also lived without formal recognition of their existence as a political community. It is to the credit of the Métis politicians and leaders that they continue their activism in subsequent years. That resulted eventually in their inclusion in the political debates over Indigenous rights in the 1960s and 1970s, and also resulted in their inclusion in the Patriotic Canadian Constitution in 1982. Since that time, the Métis have been working very hard to get, through a variety of legal and political means, to get the attention of Métis governments in terms that Section 35 of the Constitution did not grant and result in immediate sort of resolutions. Court decisions gradually expanded the recognition of Métis rights. And Bill C-53 is a long overdue recognition of the existence of Métis as rights-bearing political group, and therefore a key element in the national and cultural fabric of Canada. I offer a couple of other quick observations. This recognition is a matter of global significance. We follow it around the world, the battle of rights of Indigenous people for attention to their particular needs. But the unique struggle of cultures that emerged out of the contact experience has largely been ignored. This is an important step in that regard. Second point is that Bill C-53 capitalizes on the collective national learning over 50 years of negotiating modern treaties and restructuring constitutionally elected partnerships. And we got started in this process by negotiating very complicated, what they thought were final comprehensive agreements. But at that more than 30 to 40 years, those agreements have been signed but not fully implemented. What happens here, that process was remarkable in time and very appropriate. This approach is quite different, and I appreciate the effort of the government and the Métis Nations to do this. It starts with a very simple and important element. We're seeing official and high-profile recognition of the Métis Nations as political communities. And rather than trying to resolve all the things in a package, as happened with the modern treaties in the Canadian North, they've been working on a more foundational level, establishing recognition as a starting point, and then allowing Métis Nations to work on self-government agreements that will deal much more directly and specifically with the practical details of governance. So Bill C-53 establishes a foundation upon which the country can redefine and rebuild its relationships with the Métis. It is a bold, I think, and a valuable innovation. It'll be followed by the Métis Nations developing and expanding their Métis services and their programs. There's a lot of work actually to be done. One of the most important pieces will be defining the relationships with the individual Métis groups and also with First Nations more generally. So this is the start of a process. It is not the end. It establishes a foundation and recognition. There will be challenges, to be sure, on everything from boundaries, citizenship, membership, things of that sort. But at least it's a vital step in the right direction, aiding and encouraging the development of Métis constitutions and Métis national governments. This process is exciting, dynamic, and very important. Thank you very much, Chair.
Excellent. Right down to the second, so thank you very much for that. I have to say that we're having a bit of an issue. Your camera's zooming in and out, so it's giving us a little bit of a 3D effect here. But it's all good. The sound quality is good, and that's what's important. We're going to now go to our representatives from the Manitoba Métis Federation who are in the room. I'm not sure which of you is going to offer the comments, but it's okay. Mr. Godin, over to you, and when you're ready, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and we'll both be making some presentations here. But thank you and good afternoon, Chair, committee members, observers, and as you said, Mr. Chair, we are also proud to be able to observe National Inuit Day, and of course we know tomorrow is the National Indigenous Veterans Day, of which our nation served in many wars and conflicts with the country of Canada. We're pleased to be able to appear here before this committee on behalf of the Manitoba Métis Federation, the national government of the Red River Métis. As you know, we are in the final stages of finishing the Red River Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Treaty. We expect it to be signed by our President and the Minister in the immediate future and then presented to Parliament for final ratification. The question of identity theft. When signing and legislating a treaty, Canada needs to ask itself, who is it treating with? This was asked by the Chiefs of Ontario, and we feel the need to echo it. Who does MNO represent? it is not the historic Métis Nation. This question is unignorable, and Canadians cannot take a recognize first, ask later approach. It needs to be answered before they can be given the recognition that the Métis of the prairies have fought centuries for. We went to war with Canada in 1870 and 1885, then enlisted en masse to fight for Canada in both world wars mere decades later. Likewise, we not only built alliances with First Nations in the prairies, but did battle against them as well. All this to say is that we are known by Canada and our First Nations neighbours in the prairies as the Red River Métis. The individuals who call themselves Métis in Ontario are not known in Ontario, and just last week, Chiefs of Ontario shared with this committee that their elders have no stories of Métis ever existing in their territories. This is no longer about an individual academic or author stealing an identity. This is about the attempted theft of the identity of a nation. The people who call themselves Métis in Ontario wrap themselves in the flag of the Red River Métis, our flag that was flown at Seven Oaks at Red River. To put it simply, if those claiming to be Métis in Ontario are us, then why is it called the Red River Jig or the Red River Cart? Why is our beadwork of prairie flowers? Why would our victories and heroes and national symbols come from the prairies? Our nation goes back centuries, and we assure the committee that these historic Métis communities, quote unquote, in most of Ontario have no connection to us. Thank you. I will now turn the microphone over to Mr. Al Benoit.
Good evening, everyone. On October 26th, witnesses to this committee stated, "We deserve to advance in reconciliation just like all other Indigenous people, and consistent with how other Indigenous self-government legislation has been considered." While they also said, Bill C-53 is only about matters that are internal to our Métis self-government. But the text of C-53 is inconsistent with these statements. Firstly, there are no provisions limiting future treaties to self-government or internal matters. Secondly, C-53 allows future treaties to circumvent parliamentary procedure, which is inconsistent with the treaty ratification legislation and processes applying to all other Indigenous peoples. Contrary to C-53, the right and proper process for modern treaties since 1975 is for the treaties to be negotiated, initialed, ratified by the Indigenous people, signed by the parties, and then presented to Parliament. This allows Parliament to know what is in a treaty before it passes legislation and gives royal assent. A recent example that came before this committee is the Self-Government Treaty Recognizing Whitecap Dakota Nation Act, which received royal assent on June 22nd of this past summer. Whitecap Dakota Nation completed their treaty before legislation was introduced, not afterwards. Similarly, our soon-to-be completed Red River Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Treaty will come before Parliament together with its ratification legislation. You will have our treaty in your hand. On the other hand, C-53 is an unprecedented transfer of constitutional authority from Parliament to the Executive, and Parliament will have no further oversight or approval role in the treaty ratification. In a reversal of practice, C-53 would create a troubling precedent for entering into future treaties. Sections 5 through 7 are the heart of the problem. They empower the Governor and Council to give a treaty force and effect, to acquire constitutional protection, and give it priority over all other federal law if it meets certain unknown requirements. There is no indication in the treaty or in the legislation as to what requirements, standards, or criteria have to be met for the treaty to be approved. What are the contents of the treaty? What could they be? What will they be? There's also no indication of whether subject matters must be limited to internal self-government alone. And the question that there is no indication what an answer might be is why Parliament is being blocked from reviewing a treaty while approving its ratification legislation. As my father would say, that is back-asswards. In response, during questions, if the committee feel it right, we will suggest recommendations. In summary, with C-53, Parliament is being asked to blindly approve future, unknown, yet to be written, constitutionally protected treaties without Parliament ever seeing them. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your opening comments. We're going to get right into the first round of questions, and first up I have Mr. Vidal for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses, Mr. Coates and Mr. Gooden and Mr. Benoit. Mr. Gooden, both yourself and the MMF in general have been very vocal in speaking out against the MNO's inclusion in this bill. It's been very public. And you talked even today about the identity theft that comes with that. In my observations, I've not noticed the same concerns being raised about Saskatchewan and Alberta and kind of their presence in this or their part of this. So am I correct in maybe not assuming, but am I correct in my observations that you have less concerns or you don't have the same concerns with Saskatchewan and Alberta?
Yes, absolutely. When we look at who the historic Métis Nation is, where our homeland is, it is primarily in Western Canada. There's, we go a little bit into the United States, a little bit into Northwest Territories, and a little bit into Ontario. But the people that we're talking about who live in Saskatchewan and Alberta are us. They're related to us. They're our cousins. When we look at those new historic communities in Ontario, they're not us. They're not related to us. They have no connection to us. So I would say that you're absolutely correct.
Thank you. And I don't want to cut you off and make it short, but my time is really limited. So I'm going to be really quick with a couple more questions. So then just for absolute clarity, your position, or it is your position that the MNS and the MNA should have the right to be recognized as Métis governments in their respective provinces. That's just a simple yes or no, I suppose. But
there's some nuances in there that maybe not quite the issues raised by Mr. Benoit on treaties that aren't written yet, having a blank check.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to get. I believe that's a separate issue. But as far as if the process was, if you agreed with the process and it came back to Parliament, you don't have an issue with Alberta and Saskatchewan. Is that a safe assumption?
I would say that I don't have a problem saying that those people in Alberta and Saskatchewan are actual historic Métis Nation citizens, but there are issues that reflect how the colonial structure has divided us, and I think there's still some issues that we need to work out and that Canada is not helping us work out.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And to Mr. Benoit's point, I'm not going to ask you about recommendations right now because my time is so limited. I want to ask Mr. Coates some questions. So just be aware that you can provide those recommendations to us in writing as a submission, and we would be happy to take those if we don't get to them in the discussion today. So thanks for that. Mr. Coates, thank you for being here today as well. And I know you're a man with great knowledge and expertise. So you've heard the concerns that have been expressed, I think, in prior meetings, and you heard it today. About this very unique process that is put before us in Bill C-53, which in fact, unless you correct me, I believe it is fact that this has never been the process used in any prior Indigenous self-government legislation. So this fact that it could be approved by Cabinet or by an order in Council rather than having to come back to Parliament. There's a lot at stake in this, and so I'm just curious about your comments or whether you would have any concerns with that process that has been included, has been identified by so many people so far.
I do have concerns in the sense that I'm very much in favor of transparency on all of these kinds of arrangements, and bringing something back to Parliament for sort of ratification and clarification, I think is always a good thing. I also, at the other hand, like the idea of a process that actually starts with this general recognition and allows the sort of the formal arrangements to sort of evolve over time. We spent an enormous amount of time on the earlier treaties, the modern treaties in the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, 20 years plus to negotiate, 30 years, and most of the agreements are not implemented. So I think it's a different kind of an approach that's very practical and would proceed stepwise. But if you don't address these questions that have been asked by the Métis Nation of Manitoba and others, this is going to be an ongoing sore point, I think, which we should address ahead of time.
Thank you for that. Let me just back up the train a little bit and just ask you a hypothetical question. And basically, it's quite simple, actually. If the Government of Canada asked you, say, back in 2017, what would be appropriate direction to take on a bill like Bill C-53 that would have lessened the concerns for other right holders, what would you have offered as a response? And I think you probably get my context where we've heard some really significant concerns about lack of consultation, even when First Nations leaders have asked to be included in the discussion. So if you were to give some advice, say, a few years ago, what would that advice have been?
My experience over time suggests that, in fact, you don't consult with another group about one other group's rights. The individual group, if you were to take the Red River Métis as an example, the Saskatchewan Métis, that they can deal with their own rights and deal with them sort of directly. But I would say that unless you deal with some of these issues of identity that have been identified ahead of time, they have caused enormous difficulties in other jurisdictions. So when people flag these things as issues to be addressed, we're called to deal with them.
And so I guess my response to that would be is so much of the success in these kind of thing is built around good relationships and good conversations and being inclusive with people. Would you agree that there could have probably been more done to include others in the consultations, in the conversations that would have eased some of this?
I mean, obviously, if you've got people who are raising concerns about it, there might have been other processes. But I think you also have to respect the fact that the individual Métis nations want to deal with their rights by themselves. They don't want other people giving advice and having an influence. When I talk to folks in Saskatchewan, where most of my work has been, in fact, they're quite forward about the fact that they've had long conversations with First Nations, and they're quite comfortable with the arrangements they have there. So I think those are issues for the Métis Nation to work out with First Nations, and they've actually done so reasonably well.
Thank you, and can I just comment, Chair, that's been my experience in Saskatchewan as well, Mr. Coates, that we're not hearing the same concerns in Saskatchewan. So I think you and I align on what we're hearing there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We're now going to go over to my colleague, to our colleague, Mr. Carr, for his 6 minutes. But I also wanted to welcome Ms. Adwin back to our committee. It's great to see you. Mr. Carr, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start just by welcoming our witnesses, and Mr. Coates is somebody I've actually had the pleasure of working with in other capacities, and I have a great deal of respect for his knowledge on these particular issues, and glad to see that he's here. From my hometown, of course, I welcome Mr. Benoit and Mr. Godon. Mr. Benoit, I would also just like to say you referenced your father saying that things might be back assward, as my father would have said perhaps the wrong emphasis on the proper syllable, but I certainly appreciate the sentiment. I want to start by asking a question perhaps both Mr. Benoit and Godon can take a shot at. Just, we've heard a lot of concern around land specifically, and concerns that if this legislation as is were to pass, that in some way, shape or form this would encroach upon certain territories where rights are currently granted to both First Nations and, I would imagine from your perspective, the Manitoba Métis. Can you comment, please, on your understanding or perception of the legislation vis-a-vis land? And if my assumption is correct that you do have some concerns there, are there particular amendments within the frame of this legislation that you think would get us in a direction that would be more amenable to the MMF on that specific question?
So I'm going to jump in here first and allow Mr. Benoit to clean up whatever I mess up here. But I just wanted to make a note there. Dr. Coates talked about Métis Nations, plural, and I want to make it clear that there is only one historic Métis Nation. There are Métis governance structures within what is now provincial jurisdictions, but our homeland is ours, and it's not made up of these boxes that were made by the colonial government. One of the things that may not have been brought to the attention here is what is the prime purpose, as stated in the Constitution of the Métis Nation of Ontario. And first and foremost, in their prime purpose is land. So when they say that this self-government legislation, that the treaties aren't going to be about land, it's only going to be internal structures, then there's an inconsistency when you look at what they say they want to do, what they're telling their members that they're going to do, and what they're telling the public and what they're telling the chiefs and what they're telling the committee that they're going to do. So land is an issue for sure. For us, in the homeland, what the land issues are for the so-called Métis in Ontario is less of an issue. But I was listening and watching the First Nations leadership last week, and there is a big concern. And we have been supporting them and supporting their calls for being able to ask questions. So for us, land is absolutely vital. It's important. We have our own process. We went to court. We won at the Supreme Court in MMF v. Canada, and we're working on a process that's distinct and separate from this kind of work here. But yes, that is a big issue.
If I've got another minute or two. Thank you. I think what's important is the legislation is silent. It doesn't reference what's inside of a future treaty, and it doesn't make specific reference to the contents of any previous agreements. Like there's the 2023 agreements from February of this year. There's self-government agreements. They're mentioned in the preamble that they contemplate a treaty, but they don't use that to say what is the treaties going to be about. There's nothing that says that this legislation is about land. But it doesn't say it's really about citizenship. It doesn't say it's about governance structure. It doesn't say it's about elections. It's completely silent in the legislation, because it doesn't refer to a specific table of contents for the treaty or a table of contents of a previous agreement. So these possible future treaties, they're blank sheets of paper. And what C-53 does is give the executive and these three groups unrestricted pens with which they can write, new constitutional instruments or treaties, but unrestricted. And I think the recommendations would be, if we were doing an analogy, is to put some lines on the page and say, and this is the way it's always been, put some lines on the page so we know what is being colored in. Is land part of it?
Sorry, I'm just going to
silent.
pause for a second. We have a minute left. We have bell lights. I just want to make sure that we're just going to check and see what's going on here. And for our witnesses and those in the audience, when we have bells, we have to pause, and to continue through bells, we need unanimous consent. Just want to make sure that we're just not seeing a electrical glitch here. Yeah, where's the...
They're going to check.
Can you turn the screen on?
Yeah, sure.
Just for a second.
I haven't received an email, so usually I get an email when bells are ringing. Sit through the bells.
Okay, so colleagues, we do... Yeah.
Jamie, you can't call
So we're able to go through quorum. This is a new one. I just need advice from the clerk on whether we can go through quorum bells or if we need to suspend. So yeah, just give me a second to consult, and we'll... Anyway, I'm going to suspend here just as we get clarification. We'll get back in as soon as we can. So we're suspended. You have 1 minute left, and then we'll move to Madame Gill.
Mr. Benoit, I'll apologize on behalf of parliamentarians on this side of the House. Sometimes there are some shenanigans that take place that interfere with the important work we're undertaking here. With the time I have remaining, I will be glad to pass it back to you, although if you can permit me in the... No, not at all. If you could permit me about 20 seconds at the end, but maybe if you want to take 30 just to finish your point.
I think I wasn't clear. I said there was nothing written. I think what needs to be clear is that there be amendments like, firstly, make a clarification that there's no Section 35 land, natural resources, water, other rights included in these treaties under this legislation, and that it is limited specifically to self-government matters only. Like, there needs to be clarity and explicit clarity in the legislation. A second one would amendment that would help would clarification that the duty to consult is a prerequisite before treaty signing. That 3 treaties be completed and signed before treaty ratification legislation is brought to Parliament. and bring it back into the proper process. And that Section 5 be rewritten to eliminate the ability of the Governor and Council to order a treaty come into force before the treaty and its ratification legislation being brought to and approved by Parliament.
Thanks, Mr. Benoit. I am out of time, but if I can just ask as a follow-up, if the MMF could provide the committee in the next couple of days, if possible, with those recommendations, the recommended amendments in writing, that would be helpful for us to consider while we undertake our discussion in the near future about amendments. So I thank you for your perspective on this.
Great. Now we're going to move to Madame Gill, who will have 6 minutes on the clock. Madame Gill, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Coates. Good on Benoit. I have a question with regard to consultations that you've just brought up. This is a word that comes back often and has since the beginning of the hearings with our witnesses. Mr. Coates also mentioned it with regard to identity and legitimacy, and I would have liked to hear you on the type of consultation, because Mr. Benoit, you talked about the issue of procedure and the form of these consultations, which could be very different with regard to other treaties. And I'd like to hear each of you, actually, Mr. Godon, Benoit, and Cote, with regard to this issue. Thank you.
Mr. Benoit has been instrumental in the work with our self-government agreements and with the treaty. So I'm going to let him express that, but I just wanted to say of my understanding of the duty to consult is that when Section 35 rights could be affected, not will be or are, could be affected, then there is a trigger that happens for the duty to consult. And I know the Chiefs of Ontario are absolutely correct in that their rights, Section 35 rights, their treaty rights could be affected, so that there needed to be some discussions happening with them. Canada seems to have learned its lesson when they asked us to do our self-government agreement and then our treaty, where we literally were on the road across the country talking to Red River Métis from Toronto to Vancouver, all over Manitoba and throughout the homeland. We did extensive consultations. And not only that, it was my understanding that there was some time periods that Canada needed in order to consult with the Métis Nation of Alberta, the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, the First Nations leaderships in Manitoba. So they were able to find time and the ability to consult on our treaty, but apparently there wasn't that same ability to consult on Bill C-53. Am I right?
Yes, all I will add to that is that duty consult is about impacting of rights. The unfortunate part about the way Bill C-53 is structured is that this consultation on the treaty happens at some unknown period of time in the future. And that's why we think it's important that in the legislation it says the duty to consult needs to be done when these treaties are being done. And unfortunately, there's nothing that says that there is going to be a duty to consult. People talk about it, but there's nothing in law, at least in the legislation, that says it has to be done. And duty to consult, we are doing duty to consult with the First Nations and the Métis Nation Alberta, Métis Nation Saskatchewan, and others. And I know recently you had someone come to the committee and said that Canada is not doing any consultations with the First Nations in Manitoba. There was a 45-day period, firstly, and then it was extended another 30 days for consultation in Manitoba. So for someone saying that, oh, the Manitoba Métis and Government of Canada are not consulting, we've done it internally and it's being done externally.
Monsieur Coates, je sais pas si vous avez quelque...
Mr. Coates, I don't know if you have anything to add. Maybe a different point of view with regard to this issue?
I'll be very brief. if you don't do appropriate consultations, and that question about appropriate is extremely important, you're going to be facing all sorts of conflicts and stuff down the line. And so you have to get to a point, not with perfect resolution. There will always be people having differences of opinion about everything from land and resources and rights and things of that sort. But you have to have a clear process where people have been allowed to speak their piece, and you've heard what people had to say. What I like about the Bill C-53 process, and there are some problems people have identified, is it actually transfers a lot of the responsibility of that consultation and hopefully the resources to the Métis Nations, and to let the individual groups do a lot of those discussions, because those are where the most important sort of resolutions will actually occur.
Peut-être pour...
To continue to another question, Mr. Coates, you mentioned the issue of consultation and the process. Do you have the impression that there is any inequity or inequality between the process in Manitoba and the other Métis nations?
All four Métis nations, the national governments have actually dealt with this quite differently. So obviously you've heard about the Manitoba situation, and they've taken a very proactive and very engaging approach. So has Saskatchewan. Alberta a little bit less so, because they've got some specific community issues to deal with, and Ontario a very different pattern. So they have not followed a single pattern. And I guess I would resist anything that would be the suggestion that the government of Canada would impose rules on them. I think this is something itself that has to be done in consultation with the Métis Nations.
Okay, the 6 minutes goes fast. That's the end of that time, and now we'll go to Ms. Edlute, who will have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am happy to be here today to be able to ask my questions, and I am proud that it is our International Inuit Day today, that we are taking part in it. First, I want to ask Ken, you are educators, mighty super educators yourself, and you have experienced being sent to school and colonialized. Yes, in reading all your material, this is what you have informed us of. Now, in considering your knowledge and your education, when you are negotiating to have your self-government, and when you state that Bill C-53 is not a bill to claim lands, what I'm asking is, if you were to get your self-government, would you be able to go forward without any lands?
Indigenous person. I was raised in the Yukon, so I have a northern sort of orientation on the issues at hand. But I'm not an Indigenous person and not a Métis person from Saskatchewan. But having done research
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I don't know how it was interpreted, but what I was trying to ask is that in your colonial academic experience as a non-Indigenous person, is it possible to have a self-government agreement that has no attachments to land because of who you are as an academic? I'm interested in your response.
I mentioned at the very beginning, that's an excellent question, really excellent question. But I mentioned at the beginning that this is a very unique exercise on global terms, because in fact, the relationship with the land has been central to all the other modern treaties. Certainly in Nunavut, Yukon, Northwest Territories, even in urban First Nations like the Tsawwassen First Nation, the land element is absolutely central. The Métis folks, for no fault of their own, have been dispersed very widely over Western Canada, pushed out of Red River through processes that our Métis colleagues know very, very well, but also then pushed even further from Saskatchewan into the Northwest Territories. So you end up with a Métis population that's widely distributed. And so there are some Métis communities with land issues right close at hand, but many of the Métis have been pushed into all sorts of different corners. It is a strength of the Métis Nation, and I'll use the collective word here, that this community has not only flourished, but actually gone stronger over the last 50 to 100 years. That even though they've been scattered without access to controllable land, they've actually done an excellent job of mounting sort of a political representation and putting political demands forward. So I don't know exactly what it looks like as part of the education system. I know that it's a really exciting experiment, and I think in the 21st century we can figure this out. And I think doesn't mean there won't be land issues to be dealt with, as our colleagues from Manitoba have already said. But boy, this is an important sort of initiative. The whole business of that distributed populations is one that's central to all Indigenous peoples. The folks from Nunavut have moved down in large numbers to Ottawa and to Montreal. You figured out systems for incorporating those individuals in your governance and in your administration. I think this is a bold experiment and one we should find a way to embrace as best we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I want to ask witnesses for MNF. You have stated that you are concerned that the Métis Nations of Ontario, as part of this panel, they were studied last year, and after the study, the 25% were eliminated, were removed as relations. Now, I want to ask, have you been able to solve these problems? So I wanted to ask the MMF if they could answer my question.
Address that. The short answer is no. The 25% that were excluded were the very obvious ones that had little connection to anywhere. But what took place after that, and I'm not sure if the committee is aware of this, but back in 2017, the province of Ontario and the government of Canada all of a sudden recognized a whole bunch, 5 or 6 or 7 new communities in Ontario with no connection to the historic Métis Nation. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is, if they're not connected to the historic Métis Nation, there is only one Métis Nation, who are these people? We've seen the First Nations chiefs talk about the ancestors that are theirs are being hijacked in order to recreate Métis communities where there were none. So it is my supposition that this agreement between the MNO, and people keep saying it's an agreement between the Métis Nation or Métis people of Ontario. These people are not Métis. They're not Métis because they're not connected to the historic Métis Nation. So there's an agreement between people who are calling themselves Métis and the government of Canada, but there is no agreement now in Ontario that says that they are any type of agreement between the Métis, so-called Métis, and Canada.
Great, thank you. That takes us to the end of the first round. Colleagues, I'm going to look for direction now from the committee. We did have a late start. I've heard from a number of members that you do have commitments, as often happens, around our regularly scheduled end time, 5:30. We do have resources to continue beyond that. But the next panel has 3 witnesses. So we need time to change over, 15 minutes for opening statements, 24 minutes for a round of questions. That'll take us well past 5:30, probably closer to 5:45. So we could either do a 15-minute panel or extension to this panel, but that just pushes things later into the evening, or we regrettably end it now and go set up the second panel. So looking for the direction from the committee.
I thought the witness testimony was excellent. I thought they have some really good recommendations that they're going to submit to us in written form. And as such, if we get that in written form, I think that we can move to our second panel and finish on time with a condensed one round on the other one.
Okay, and Mr. Godin, I'll go to you for a moment, and then I'll conclude.
Yeah, thank you. I know it's probably not my place, and I'm not a member of the committee, but this is an extreme. You know, I was listening and watching the Chiefs of Ontario last week, and saw their frustration when they were, cut short on different items that they wanted to express. It is the nature of the beast. I understand that, but at the same time, these issues, and we have only scratched the surface. It is about Métis politics, but the reason it is about Métis politics is because the integrity of our nation is at stake, and to have to be pushed off to the side for 15 minutes because of 15 minutes is hard to for us to take, and I know we have the opportunity to submit written submissions, and we will do that. There's no doubt in my mind. But at the same time, if there is any opportunity for us to come back, I will stay here all week if need be and come back and speak to the committee. That there's no doubt about that. And just real quickly, and I'll close after this, is there's a couple of folks in your next session, both work for the Métis Nation of Ontario, past President Tony Belcourt, who's a consultant, and Jason Madden, who's a legal counsel for Ontario. It seems that there's a lot of leeway allowed for those voices, and I'm just concerned that the voices for the actual historic Métis Nation is being has less of a voice. Thank you.
Do you guys? Yeah. Mr. Carr.
May I suggest that we extend the 15 minutes to our current witnesses to conclude the panel?
One full round with our second panel.
Then a second round.
If we can, we would have the resources to, if we want to do that. Like I say, we're trying to be as respectful. I know you've traveled a long way. You have important things to say, and many of our members are invited to a number of things this evening as well, and that's always the challenge we have. I'm here to make sure the will of the committee is met. So.
Ms.
Edlut, yes, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to see them continue because I still have some questions for them.
Is 5 minutes, 5 minutes for the Conservatives and Liberals, then 2.5 minutes for the Bloc, 2.5 minutes for the NDP. And so let's do that. So we'll go over to who wants to start? Mr. Schmale. So you'll have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for this this testimony. Maybe what we can start with is regarding the membership in Ontario that you have spoken about many times during your time here. Could we not use traditional hunting grounds or trade paths as kind of another way to determine membership rather than just saying anything from the Red River west, I guess?
I really thank you for that question, because this is something that I have been speaking on for the last 5 years at schools, universities, private institutions. There is a concept in Indigenous politics where nationhood is central to that. Nationhood is not about blood. It's not about the mixture. I'm not Métis because I'm mixed. I'm Métis because I have ancestors who were Métis, because there was an ethnogenesis of our people, of our nation. We have markers that show us to be a nation and a people, things like a language, things like kinship, which is so important. If you have a Métis person who lives in Winnipeg and one who lives in Edmonton or Yellowknife or Lac La Biche or anywhere in the homeland, guaranteed we are related. That cannot be said for any of these new communities in Ontario, which all of a sudden materialized in 2017. We have other markers that identify us, cultural markers. We have clothing. If you look at both of our vests here today, you will see a very distinctive beadwork type. That's Red River Métis beadwork. That belongs to the Red River. And the Red River Métis is not Manitoba. I just want to make that clear. The Red River Métis is the same thing as a historic Métis nation. Our flag was flown at Red River. It was not flown at Sault Ste. Marie. The Red River Cart, the Red River Jig, as I have said, these are identifiers of us in music, dance, food, culture, and political action is also one of the most primary things that political scientists point to. And we can go all the way back to what is known as the Battle of Seven Oaks, what we call the Victory of Frog Plain, throughout the 19th century to President Louis Riel in Red River and in the Northwest, and into the 20th century as well. Political action where we came together to assert not only our rights for how we live, our economics, our land. These are things that make a nation and make a people. These things are absent when you look at these communities. They just recreated them using circular logic in Ontario. So it's not the same thing.
Sorry, I do have limited time. So would there an amendment that would give the process, the parliamentary approval for treaty, be something that would help ease some of your concerns?
Yeah, absolutely. Take MNO out of Bill C-53. Okay,
so what about if we had rather than just eliminating MNO from C-53, what if you had mentioned earlier that no parliamentary approval, only cabinet, and I do agree that that's a concern, only cabinet has the approval of a treaty, which is, again, for most parliamentarians is raising some eyebrows. But having that parliamentary approval, would that be something, keeping MNO in, ease some of your concerns?
No, because MNO, they're not Métis. So you would be treating with people who aren't us, who aren't Métis. And you'd be signing agreements with them for Section 35 rights that they have no right to. So that one is a non-starter.
So, how much time do I have, Chair?
Just 45 seconds.
Would you not agree, though, that MNO has been using Powley as a roadmap? They're using others as well to kind of lock down their membership?
Mr. Benoit?
Yeah, they're just not using Powley. If you go to their agreement, which is mentioned in the preamble of this legislation, they have two quotes in there, and those quotes are directly out of MMFV Canada from 2013. And they're cloaking themselves with our courts as well, our decisions as well, in addition to our culture, our battles, our symbols, our leadership.
We're unfortunately out of time on this one, so I'm going to have to go over to Mr. Batiste for his 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you for that. You made some very strong comments at the opening about identity theft. And is it your opinion that the only Métis that are recognized in Canada are those belonging to the Red River and that have expanded out?
In the history of the world, colonialism happened.
I got 5 minutes. Can you?
Colonialism, absolutely. Colonialism happened everywhere. Nowhere else in the world was there an ethnogenesis of a people like the historic Métis Nation, which happened in Western Canada, Northwestern North America. So I would say no. What I would say is, are there folks who had mixed marriages, who have a part European and part First Nations ancestry? Absolutely. did that result in an ethnogenesis of a nation? No, it did not. So if we're talking about a nation, then yes, there is only one historic Métis nation. Now, M&O likes to use the word communities because Pauli used the word community. And to me, that's still problematic. A community is not a nation. There could be friends and neighbors and people who live together and work together. But where is those markers that I talked about? The language, the culture, the food, the dance, the music, the symbols, the heroes. Louis Riel is not their hero. He's our hero.
Okay, in your introduction, you said that the Métis homelands extend from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, you said Northwest Territories, and I quote, a little bit of Ontario. Can you tell me how much is a little bit of Ontario in terms of under the MMF's definition of how far the Métis extend? Yeah,
it's not just the MMF. Actually, there's a resolution that was passed in 2018 by the Métis National Council General Assembly, and it's still on the books to this day. It has not been repealed. So if you look at the book by Jean Thayer, she talks about the closing or the amalgamation of the two fur trade companies, the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company, in 1821. And in 1821, that effectively closed off the portage at Rat Portage in Northwest Ontario. So there was no more movement. All the movement went around into the United States. So any connection that may have been there, and there was only a generation or two of Métis at that time, was closed. So there was no movement between those other communities and the nation. So, that's historic. It's in, Ms. Tay's book, and I think it's quite proper.
Thank you. And can you share that resolution with this committee so that we can have a better understanding of what was accepted by MNC's overall map of the Métis Federation?
Yes.
I have a tough last question. Under the Indian Act, which I'm a part of as a status Indian, I have a cutoff clause. If I can pass on my status as an Indian only 2 generations, one to my child if I marry outside of the Indian Act, and if my child chooses to marry and have kids outside of the Indian Act, we have a 2nd generation cutoff. To what extent does a Métis person ancestry go till?
So fortunately, we are not involved and do not participate in the Indian Act. You heard the Chiefs' leadership last week saying that they want to be able to determine their own citizenship, and they should. It should not be a colonial structure determining who their citizens are, who their people are. It should have never been that way. We are absolutely, in some ways, Canada's ignored us for 150 years. In some ways, that's been a blessing because we didn't have to be subject to that kind of meddling.
So there is no ancestral cutoff for the Métis of MMF at all?
Again, being Métis is not about blood. It's not about blood quantum. It's about being a part of a nation, about being a part of the culture, and being able to participate in events, dancing the jig, playing the fiddle. That is, it's not about blood quantum, and it never will be under our current leadership.
So how do you determine the ancestral part of the Pauli test?
We don't have the Pauli test. We have our own definition that happened in 2002 before Pauli because we knew Pauli was going to be problematic. And under UNDRIP, we have the right of self-determination, and even the Supreme Court of Canada isn't going to tell us who our citizens are.
And can you send that to our committee as well in terms of whatever motion you have on that?
The 2002 definition? Yeah.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Monsieur Garon, who will have 2.5 minutes. So this one and Ms. Idloot's time goes very quickly.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here with us today. And the Conservatives have already raised the issue of your opposition to this bill. I'd like to know what kind of amendments could be made to this bill to make it acceptable for you, because I understand your position is not necessarily irreconcilable with this situation. But if you could help us in that regard, it would be very useful.
Yes, we'll send you our recommendations. But I think what's really important is that there needs to be a treaty attached to the legislation. There needs to be a way of Parliament knowing what they're voting on when they do vote for the legislation and it gets royal assent. And so far today we've talked about land, we've talked about the duty to consult, that it has to be brought to Parliament for consideration, and that so the treaties aren't written on blank sheets of paper. You're not giving blank sheets of paper to them to write on. And the Section 5 be completely rewritten to prevent an end run around Parliament. And I know my ministers brought up M&O possibly being severed. And what's really important, and I know this seems to always go back, people always talk about there's Pauli. Pauli just talked about what was happening around Sault Ste. Marie and its environs. And now that's blown up to be something that's for all of Ontario. What Pauli did is create principles for membership or citizenship, and who had rights and what communities had rights. And currently it's only focused on Sault Ste. Marie. And I know in Manitoba, for the Red River Métis community, we have the Goodon decision. The gentleman sitting here had gone to court. So what you have to realize is that there's a lot of things that just need to be clarified. And when we talk about Pauli, we can't allow Pauli to make things smoky and misty and vague. If you don't see something written in the legislation, don't trust that it will be there, and don't say that it points to one thing or another, because it's completely blank. Thank you.
Okay, and we're at the end of the time, unfortunately. Ms. Idlut, we're going to go to you now for your 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to ask the MNF. You said that you are concerned about identity theft of those who claim to be Métis. Now, the Métis children, descendants, if they needed support in the future, who would support them? If the Métis Nation of Ontario was not there, who would support them?
As I said before, the huge, vast majority of the membership of MNO is not Métis. So if they're not Métis, those children are not Métis, and there's not a need for them to be supported by, they can be supported as Canadians, as Ontarians. There's no doubt about that.
Thank you for that. I understand your response.
Okay.
What evidence do you have that the Métis Nation of Ontario Métis are not Métis?
I think that everything that I said before, there's no kinship connections, there's no political action that puts us together, there is no common language. Métis is not a word like Indian or First Nations, where there's all kinds of different groups within that. Métis is a nation, is one historic nation. So all of these markers that make us who we are, and a distinct Indigenous nation, is not present in Ontario in these new communities. And if I might add, the problem is maybe not the proof for me trying to prove a negative, is that the proof is that that the research is absolutely sloppy. I was just given a report today by a couple of esteemed academics, Dr. Celeste Pedri-Spade and Daryl LaRue, that did a research paper on the Sault Ste. Marie Métis community, and that's absolutely something that we can send to you as well as some of the other work that Dr. LaRue and others have done with respect to some of the other so-called Métis communities in Ontario. We will make sure that those are available to the committee as well.
Okay, and that takes us to the end of that round of questioning. So With that, I do need to conclude this panel. Thank you to all of our witnesses, Dr. Coates, Mr. Benoit, Mr. Godin, for joining us here today. As we said, we're allowed to take additional written briefs. So based on the conversation today, anything you'd like to send us, it's limited to 10 pages. And we have received lots of material, but anything further you feel you would help us sort through this legislation would be very much appreciated, and that can be directed to our clerk. Colleagues, I was asked for the map as well, if you can send us that. Folks, we're going to suspend now while we bring in the next panel, and we'll be starting up as soon as we get our sound checks done and everybody's settled comfortably. So for now, we're suspended.